This video is sponsored by CarnageCon. More about them later on. The Stoic Knights of the Black Templars are members of one of the Imperium's oldest and largest Space Marine chapters. They are unique in that they almost entirely eschew the teachings of Robute Guilliman's Codex Astartes, choosing instead to adopt their own combat doctrines, organizing their chapter as they see fit and engaging in battle in reckless displays of righteous aggression. This chapter is composed of thousands of crusade fleets, boasting the strength of entire Space Marine battle companies and able to field hundreds of Astartes warriors on a battlefield where most chapters would be limited to only dozens. The size and spectacle of Black Templars crusades engenders a culture of competitive skill at arms. Black Templars are known for their consummate swordsmanship and dueling prowess, and prefer to engage the enemies of mankind in brutal close-range combat. On the battlefield, Black Templars are a Space Marine chapter, a subfaction of the Adeptus Astartes, that plays very uniquely. They have almost entirely unique faction mechanics and access to a dizzying array of exclusive units that allows them to play a very different and much more aggressive game plan than their more Codex-compliant counterparts. Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we are going to be diving into another faction in Warhammer 40k. We're talking about the Black Templars and going through how to construct an army for them in the game's 10th edition, starting from a combat patrol and moving all the way through Incursion and Strike Force games, and discussing tactics and strategies that you can use to play these armies. As always with this series, this is intended simply as a suggestion for how to build your collection, and if you have particular tastes in units or detachments, you should always feel free to pursue those. I'm going to be doing something a little bit different with this video. All of the army lists that I present here are actually going to come in at a few points under the limit. That's to allow points to change or you to take some units that you're more personally interested in rather than suggesting you adhere to a strict guideline. That also means that if any of the points values in this video increase in the future, there should be a points buffer in order to account for that. Black Templars are a Space Marine chapter. Space Marines have a unique capacity to take a second faction keyword, which allows them to unlock unique abilities and in some cases detachments. These are their Space Marine chapter keywords, and in this case we are going to be talking about the Black Templars chapter. Now, Black Templars are entirely unique within Space Marines in that they are a Codex non-compliant chapter, which means they use a separate supplement for additional units and detachments that they can play alongside the rules included in the core Space Marine Codex. However, normally they would get a depowered version of the Oaths of Moment faction ability. In this case, however, Black Templars simply don't get Oaths of Moment whatsoever. They instead exchange that for an entirely new faction mechanic. No other Space Marine chapter does this. All other Space Marine chapters use Oaths of Moment. Black Templars, however, use Templar Vows. This allows them at the start of the first battle round of a game, so after your deployment is complete, and you know who's taking the first turn, to pledge a vow for the remainder of the game. These are either Abhor the Witch, Destroy the Witch, which gives you charge rerolls targeting Psyker models and precision against Psyker characters. Accept any challenge no matter the odds, which gives you +1 to wound if your strength characteristic is less than or equal to your opponent's toughness characteristic. This is very powerful because it allows the relatively mid-strength sword attacks that many Black Templars units are carrying to deal damage to even high toughness targets. Whereas normally they would have a trouble cutting through battle tanks and larger enemies like that, this Templar Vow would allow them to do so. Suffer Not the Unclean to Live allows you to fall back and charge, as well as gives you more flexible pile-in and consolidate moves. And Uphold the Honor of the Emperor allows you to secure objectives that you hold in your command phase with your infantry squads. That means that if you hold it at the end of your command phase, then you will hold it permanently until your opponent comes and takes it back at the start of a phase. It also allows you to perform actions on turns in which you advance. This is very powerful for objective scoring. Now, I will say, as you are getting started in with the faction, I would almost always choose Accept Any Challenge no matter the odds. This is the most powerful damage-dealing vow you can take. While the other vows are useful in other situations, this one's going to be the most commonly useful, especially for the types of melee profiles that Black Templars tend to bring. As you gain experience with the faction, I would start considering situations in which the other Templar vows may have been more useful, but as a general rule, if you are just learning, I would almost always select this one. Now, with that, Black Templars also gain a bevy of unique detachments, as well as many unique units. One thing I want to talk about in this faction is their use of critical hit keywords. There are many weapon keywords in Warhammer 40,000 that trigger off critical hits. A critical hit is naturally a hit roll of a 6, which then automatically confers a hit regardless of what your weapon skill is, and also can apply some additional effects, such as sustained hits, which gives you additional hits on critical hits, or lethal hits, which automatically causes those critical hits to wound. Black Templars absolutely love using critical hits. One thing you'll notice is that most of their in-faction units tend to have lethal or sustained hits on all of their melee attacks. They also improve this with improved critical effects, which gives them those critical hits on a roll of a 5 or a 6, rather than just a 6. Whereas Templar vows are the faction ability, a faction theme is trying to gain these critical hits by giving themselves hit rerolls and trying to roll these 5-ups. As we move on to talk about units, keeping those critical hits in mind is going to be pretty important. And speaking of which, let's dive in and talk about the Black Templars Combat Patrol.
But first, sponsor time.
This video is sponsored by the Carnage Gaming Convention and its miniature gaming events presented by Drago Games. Held every year in Killington, Vermont in the month of October, the Carnage Gaming Convention is a long-running staple of New England tabletop gaming and features events for a dizzying variety of games, including board games, tabletop games, and of course miniature games, all hosted in a picturesque Vermont ski resort. So not only do you get to be surrounded by cool games, but also incredible vistas. Look at these vistas. Available at the event are going to be competitive events for Age of Sigmar, Warhammer 40,000, as well as a variety of other specialist games, including Mordheim, Kill Team, Star Wars Shatterpoint, and Bolt Action. Carnage 28 is occurring October 24th through 26th, 2025, so check out the link in the video description to get your tickets today.
Now, anytime a player starts in Warhammer 40k or starts a new faction, I always recommend that they get started with the Combat Patrol for that faction. It gives you a good baseline of units to play with in a very simple format in which to learn the core and army mechanics. Now, that said, the Black Templars Combat Patrol is kind of a middling utility. There are some very useful units that you'll use almost throughout your Black Templars experience. Units like Primera Sword Brethren are incredibly powerful, and the Emperor's Champion is both iconic and very commonly played in Black Templars armies. It's a little bit inconsistent that it does also include a unit of Blade Guard veterans. Unfortunately, Black Templars have almost no internal synergy with specifically this unit. That's because most of their characters have explicit synergy with Sword Brethren, which are essentially the in-faction version of Blade Guard veterans. They are the Primaris melee veterans, and Blade Guard veterans are more of a Codex compliant unit. So unfortunately, most Black Templar specific characters do not actually join Blade Guard veterans, and they have very little use in the faction. That said, they are included in the Combat Patrol, so we are going to be using them today in our lists in order to make use of all of the models that we have in order for efficiency. And in many cases, you'll find that they're just going to be used as an objective holder. In that capacity, they're totally fine. They can just stand on objectives and score you points and fight other light utility units, and they'll probably kill 5 Space Marines and a go, which is going to be fairly useful. However, as you expand your collection, they'll probably be left by the wayside. Now, once we start talking about moving to Incursion game modes, this is the first kind of standard game size that Warhammer 40k will play outside Combat Patrol, and it moves up to 1,000 points, which is about a doubling of the size from your starting Combat Patrol. Now, once we start to talk about Incursion lists, we have to talk about the standard list building restrictions that Warhammer 40k imposes. This includes the requirement to take a detachment. In this case, I recommend that you start with the basic Space Marine detachment from the core rulebook, which all Space Marine chapters have access to, the Gladius Task Force. It is very commonly played in a variety of Space Marine chapters because it's incredibly flexible, but especially if you are newer to the game, it is essentially constructed as a new player learning tool. The army ability allows you to choose a combat doctrine, choosing each one of them once per game, either giving your army advance and shoot, fall back, shoot and charge, or advance and charge, allowing you to buff your ranged attacks, melee attacks, or your flexibility, depending on the tactical situation. You also have stratagems that allow you to flip units into any one of these particular doctrines at any time that you wish, which allows you an incredibly flexible unit selection. Black Templars have particular affinity with Gladius Task Force because they tend to focus on both melee and ranged attacks. They want to be taking their incredibly powerful melee units, but they want to be supporting them with some of their unique gun platforms, which means that a detachment as flexible as Gladius Task Force is a no-brainer for the faction. As you gain experience and learn more about how Black Templars work, switching to some of the more unique Black Templars detachments is definitely a way that you can expand your experience. But Gladius Task Force offers you the greatest flexibility to learn about your units as you are building your collection. Now, when we're moving on to our incursion list, we've added a couple characters as well as some utility units and one main battle tank. These characters include both a Castellan and a Marshal. Now, I'm going to be talking about these two characters essentially in the same breath because they are kind of a combination. Usually they're taken in pairs because the Castellan has the ability to attach to a unit that a Marshal has already attached to, allowing you to dual attach two characters to a single squad. Now, these two characters are kind of the core of Black Templar melee units. They are constructed specifically to work together and they synergize incredibly with each other. First off is the Castellan. This is kind of a lower ranking officer in the Black Templars, the equivalent of a Space Marine Lieutenant. He gives you reroll ones to hit while he's leading a unit. In addition, he can take a leadership check, which on a leadership characteristic of 6 is a very good chance to pass. If he passes that check, he gives you full hit rerolls. Now, unlike most other Space Marine chapters, Black Templars don't get access to Oaths of Moment, so gaining hit rerolls for them is very powerful. And as we'll move on to other units, you'll find that most of the units that we end up taking in this faction have baked in rerolls somewhere. He also has the ability to gain you command points when he destroys units, which is pretty nice. And he brings 6 2-damage lethal hit melee attacks as well. Now, that is further improved by the Marshal. The Marshal gives you 5+ critical hits, and as we just discussed, Black Templar units absolutely love having critical effects. In this case, units like both these characters and the Primaris Sword Brethren all have lethal hits on their melee attacks. And when the Marshal's leading that unit, he gives them 5+ critical hits, which means that they are twice as likely to score an automatic wound with that lethal hit weapon. Now, when that is combined with the Castellan, not only is the Castellan adding 6 more melee attacks, that bunch, but also giving you hit rerolls, giving you a greater chance to potentially score those critical effects. The Marshal is also a powerful melee combatant by himself. He brings at minimum 8 melee attacks. This is because of his Pious Fervor ability, which gives him additional melee attacks for each enemy unit within 6 inches of him. At the very least, if he's attacking in melee, there is one enemy unit next to him, so he's already more powerful than most other Space Marine characters, but very quickly, if he drives deep into the heart of the enemy, he can be getting up to 10 melee attacks. All of those with lethal hits, rerolls from the Castellan, and improved criticals from his own ability. That's insane. Once we attach that into a Primaris Sword Brethren squad to add to their already 15 2-damage melee attacks that they're bringing, this unit can go absolutely wild. So just to showcase how powerful this Marshal plus Castellan combo is, I want to discuss it in the context of one of these Sword Brethren units. So let's assume that we have 5 Sword Brethren with Mastercrafted power weapons. That gives them a 3 attacks with a 2-damage lethal hit weapon. If we have 5 of them in a unit, that gives us 15 attacks. The Marshal gets 7 attacks base plus at least 1 attack for having an enemy unit nearby. In this case, obviously, he's engaging them. And then we have 6 additional attacks from our Castellan. Now, let's assume we're attacking something that's high toughness 10 or higher, so that we would be wounding it naturally on 6s with no bonuses. So if we go ahead and roll, these attacks will roll hit on 2s. We will get at least real 1s from the Castellan. Then we're going to go ahead and wound these on 6s, which is going to give us a paltry number, somewhere around, I don't know, between 2 and 4 wounds is usually what you can expect here. Now, taking into account the unit's critical hits, we can go ahead and roll and take our 6s to hit and turn those into automatic wounds. Now, in this case, obviously, we are rerolling our 1s, so we're going to go ahead and reroll those. The unit hits on 2s. These attacks can get pulled out as lethal hits, so that's 7 automatic wounds right there already, and then any additional 6s to wound are going to be added in the pile as well, giving us a total of 10 successful wounds using only lethal hits from this unit. Now, if we do this experiment again, and we assume that we're going to take into account the critical 5s from the Marshal's ability, that's going to give all of these hits automatic wounds. We're going to go ahead and reroll our 1s to wound, turn those into automatic wounds as well, and then wound on 6s here for an additional 2. So that critical 5s has added a significant amount of additional damage, almost doubling our total. In this case, giving us about 15% more wounds. Now, rerolls in 40k are worded kind of weirdly. It's when you make an attack, you reroll a hit roll. This doesn't require that you reroll a missed hit roll, so we could potentially reroll successful hit rolls so that if we are wounding on high numbers like 6s, we could try to fish reroll successful hits to then get that critical hit through. Now, if you're winning on 6s, that's usually a pretty good call because the value of an additional critical hit is higher than that of a standard hit that you're just basically 1 in 6 chances is going to go ahead and turn into a wound roll. And because these guys hit on 2s, there's a pretty reasonable chance for a standard hit to still hit even if you re-roll it. It will only miss then on a 1, so the upside's pretty high. So if we go ahead and take this roll, then take any non-5 or 6 die and re-roll it, trying to get a 5 or a 6, we can see here that our critical hit number expands significantly. That is 17 hits, only 4 misses. We're going to roll these for 6s to wound and get another 2 for 20 total wound rolls that will go to a save. Basically doubling the expectedness of our unit versus just getting a standard critical 5. As you can see, the total value of this combination is absolutely crazy. And that gets even better if you assume that if we are accepting any challenge no matter the odds, we're also going to add our 5s to wound in there, making this unit force so many 2 damage saves on most targets that they're going to be able to kill things even with high armor and toughness values. And that's why this unit is so powerful. But it obviously is a combination of effects that makes it so good. Now, on top of that, we're going to be adding a little bit of utility to the army. This includes a scout squad, which can score points in the early game, and a Primaris Intercessor squad. This is just 5 Primaris Intercessors that can hang out in the back of our army and ensure that none of our powerful melee units need to move backwards in order to score objectives. Now, last but certainly not least is a mainstay of the Black Templars faction, the Black Templar Repulsor Executioner. Now, Black Templars are unique in that they have different armor profiles than most other Space Marine chapters. Unlike most Space Marine chapters, they actually mount heavy weapons on their pintle mounts, so they're able to take multi-meltas on their cupola rather than the heavy stubber that most Space Marine tanks are able to take. In some cases, this also gives them special abilities, and in this case, the Repulsor Executioner for Black Templars has a separate data sheet from the standard Repulsor Executioner. This gives it full hit rerolls if it targets an enemy with a friendly Astartes unit within 12 inches of it. Meaning that, essentially, if you've painted a target with your scouts or even your more powerful melee units, this Repulsor Executioner is going to go kind of crazy. In addition, this also doesn't require that the, for lack of a better term, spotter unit have line of sight to the target. All you need is to have anything within 12 inches that's Adeptus Astartes from your army, and this guy goes absolutely ham. Again, we're sourcing rerolls without the need for Oath of Moment, because the faction doesn't get access to it. In addition, the Executioner also is a relatively tanky vehicle at toughness 12, and has a transport capacity of 7, allowing it to transport the Primaris Sword Brethren alongside 2 attached characters. Lastly, I want to talk briefly about the Emperor's Champion. The Emperor's Champion is an interesting unit in that you can take him in multiple ways. You can attach him into a unit to give that unit +2 to charge, and also act as a delivery system and potentially buffing his incredibly powerful melee attacks. Alternatively, he has the lone operative ability, meaning that when he's by himself, he can't be targeted by enemies that are not within 12 inches, which makes him good at holding objectives or surviving as he moves up the table to get to grips with enemies. In this case, for this particular list, I would end up attaching him to the Crusader squad here. Now, the Crusade squad is just a mainstay battle line infantry unit. They're relatively high objective control characteristic, so they're good at stealing objectives away from enemies, although their actual damage output themselves is relatively low. The downside in this case is that Crusader squads come in at a minimum of 10 models, which means that most transports aren't able to bring them to the battle. That's why smaller, more elite units tend to be more efficient for Space Marine armies, because things like repulsors or impulsors can actually transport them. In this case, the Emperor's Champion gives them +2 to charge, meaning that he acts as a little bit of a delivery system, and you're able to get this unit into melee a little bit earlier, which is pretty nice. Now, when it comes to playing this army on the battlefield, it ends up playing relatively straightforward. We do have a couple of utility units that we're going to try to score points with early. Our Scout Squad can infiltrate up into the center of the battlefield. They also possess Scout, so after all the players have deployed and after you've determined who goes first, they get to move 6 inches, which allows them to place relatively aggressively, and then if you end up not going first, moving back behind areas of cover so that your opponent isn't in range to attack them. A trick I always like to use with scouting models like this is to measure their potential hiding spot first. So in this case, we can hide them in a ruin here in the center of the battlefield, and then push them 6 inches out from there. Then you know that if you deploy them in this position and you go second, they will be able to scout with their scout move back to this position in order to not get attacked on turn 1. You want to use your Blade Guard veterans to maintain control of one of the side objectives, normally your expansion objective, which is the objective closest to your deployment zone that isn't the one inside your deployment zone. This allows them to simply run out on turn 1 and hold down that objective for the majority of the game. They're not the easiest unit in the world to kill. They do have a 4+ invulnerable save thanks to their storm shields, and enemies moving up to contest this objective will probably be killed by them, so they're pretty good in this capacity. Now from there, we have the Repulsor Executioner. I recommend that you begin these units inside the transport, so attaching the Castellan and the Marshal into the Sword Brethren squad, and then embarking all of them into the Repulsor Executioner. This gives you a couple of benefits. First off, it protects them in the early game, so your Executioner, if your opponent doesn't have prodigious anti-tank, is probably not in grave danger, and then you're going to be able to get those models closer to your target without exposing them to enemy anti-infantry fire. But then, in addition, you're able to disembark them 3 inches, so you gain a little bit of an additional threat range increase once you go to disembark them. You're going to be disembarking them something like this, and then that allows your unit to then move, advance, and potentially charge. Now, the turn that these guys want to charge in, if they are inside the Repulsor Executioner, I would save your use of Assault Doctrine in Gladius Task Force for that turn. The reason being is that while they're inside the transport, you can't actually use the Adaptive Tactics stratagem to give them advance and charge normally, so you have to use the detachment ability to do so unless you disembark them earlier on in the turn. So when they're committing in, I would use that doctrine in order to buff them. Now, in addition to that, we also have this unit of Primaris Crusaders. Now, you can start these guys on the battlefield if you want to. However, because the unit is so fast, it's to start them in Strategic Reserve. You can keep up to 250 points of your army in Strategic Reserve in Incursion games, and at the time of recording, this combination of units is 240 points, so it comes in just under the limit. And then, once they're in Reserve, on Battle Round 2 onwards, they're going to come in anywhere outside of your opponent's deployment zone, wholly within 6 inches of a table edge, which means your opponent has to start worrying about this unit popping up off the sides of the table. Battle Round 3, they can also come in your opponent's backline, which can be particularly scary as well. The fact that the Emperor's Champion has a higher than normal movement characteristic allows your unit to rapid ingress. You want to put them in a position where your opponent doesn't have very strong anti-infantry shooting to attack them, or even if they do, they're not going to kill too many models. Even if they do kill a couple models, you do have a surge move from the Crusader's datasheet ability that allows them to move in response to shooting, so they're just going to get closer. So you could use that to dissuade your opponent from attacking them, but you never want to put them in a position where they're just going to get picked up by shooting as soon as that occurs. However, you can put them in a position where the extra movement from the Emperor's Champion allows him to kind of pull the unit into a scary position. You can potentially, once they've ingressed, you can use the adaptive strategy to give them Assault Doctrine, so we can potentially advance them, and then we can charge them at +2. So their actual threat range coming off of Rapid Ingress is pretty far, even if they aren't triggering that reactive move in response to shooting. So this is a nice little unit, largely to force your opponent to screen it out. They're going to have to give up units like their own scouts, for example, to prevent that unit from getting a good spot on the battlefield where they can come in and then charge something valuable from your opponent. If you're able to select a character unit, you will get +2 to charge, and so because of that ability, these guys could potentially get in on a 7. If you have a character target that you're able to select as one of the targets of the charge, which can be very helpful. The one thing I would keep in mind about this army is ensuring that your Repulsor Executioner isn't exposed to really powerful enemy anti-tank early. You don't want to just throw that thing away willy-nilly, but what you can do is sort of threaten control of objectives using your scouts and using your Blade Guard veteran squad and force them to come out and deal with that. Between screening this unit from getting a good charge and preventing you from gaining access to those objectives, you can potentially force your opponent to move valuable assets forward that you can then shoot at the Repulsor Executioner and gain value from this thing. And once you're in a position where the Repulsor Executioner can push forward and you also bring the Crusade Squad out, that's a lot of damage that your opponent has to deal with. Now, it's a little bit higher level, but one potential synergy to keep in mind when considering the Sword Brethren Squad and the Repulsor Executioners is Gladius Task Force's use of reactive moves. You have the Squad Tactics reactive move when enemies move within 9 inches of your units that you can use to just hop back D6 inches. In addition to that, Primaris Sword Brethren also have a reactive move when enemies fall back from them. So if they're able to charge and get in to engage an enemy, and that enemy falls back, you could potentially, if they are nearby to the Repulsor Executioner, jump backwards and re-embark the Repulsor Executioner, if every model in the unit ends up within 3 inches of that thing. In addition, you could also potentially hop back thanks to the fallback reactive move, and if a further reactive move is triggered later on in the turn, they can then embark the transport by moving with Squad Tactics a second time. This is very powerful, and it's a good effect to keep in mind. If you're just getting started and it's a little bit complex, I would not pay too much attention to it. It's mostly for higher level play, but one of the big benefits that these guys have is access to those multiple reactive moves, which can make them very difficult for many armies to counterattack. Now, the last unit to discuss is this unit of Primaris Intercessors, just this little 5 model unit here. These guys are very helpful for holding down the back of your table. They're good because they have objective secured. So once they hold your home objective, it's going to be locked under your control until your opponent takes it, which is difficult because it is the farthest objective from their army. The one thing they could do is if they have deep strikes or reposition, redeployment effects, is they could deep strike or teleport onto the objective. So if they have those, it's important to ask your opponent at the start of the game, then I would objective secure the objective and then simply move the intercessors so that they can't deep strike on top of the objective. That forces them to charge the intercessors and come closer to your army if they want a chance to take it. From there, though, this unit actually works as a pretty nice little infantry sweeper. They shoot 20 times if they all target the same target with their bolt rifles, plus they get a grenade launcher probably on their sergeant. So they're shooting a bunch of shots and have pretty solid melee thanks to the special melee weapon on the sergeant as well. So once you get to the late game and they're no longer needed to hold down this objective, they can start moving forward and trying to take a center objective towards the end of the game, or just clearing out enemy infantry. In some cases, they can be replaced with infiltrators, which don't have the objective secured ability, but they do have enhanced deep strike screening, so your opponent doesn't even get the option to charge them out of deep strike. So if you want to spend the additional points on that unit, that's another option for a similar unit like this. But basically what we want to do is ensure that our battle tanks and our melee units don't need to be babysitting this objective all game. Now with that, let's move over to Strike Force games. This is the larger game mode that totals 2,000 points, so we've doubled the size of our Incursion army. And as you can see, a lot of this just involves sort of doubling down on some of the unit archetypes that we've already included. In this list, I've included a second unit of Primaris Sword Brethren, plus the combination of Marshals and Castellans once again, and I've taken some additional shooting in the form of primarily 2 Ballistus Dreadnoughts. Now, the Ballistus Dreadnought is a very self-contained shooting platform. They have 2 las cannon shots and 2 missile shots, and they get hit rerolls when enemies are not below half of their starting strength. So they aren't either below half of their starting wounds count or model count, depending on whether or not you are an independent single entity enemy. Very similar to the Repulsor Executioners, these guys are a ranged unit that gets baked in hit rerolls, meaning that between the Blade Guard veterans, the Primaris Sword Brethren with the Castellans, Executioners, and the Ballistus Dreadnoughts, fully half of our units are gonna have some way to get built-in hit rerolls naturally, which is hugely powerful. Now, in addition to that, I've also taken a new unit in the form of a unit of Primaris Assault Intercessors. These guys are just a solid OC2 melee unit that gains wound rerolls of 1 or full wound rerolls targeting enemies on objectives. This is very powerful for the Emperor's Champion to hop into because he could gain devastating wounds once per game on his sword. That allows him to potentially gain wound rerolls and trigger more devastating damage, which is already super powerful for him, so he goes kind of insane. In addition to that, we've also brought them a ride in the form of a Primaris Impulsor. Now, an important thing to keep in mind about the Impulsor is that it's a cheap, fast transport, so you can use it kind of as a utility unit to go score objectives, or to score tactical secondaries, or sit and stand on an objective. But as I mentioned in the Incursion section, there's a lot of synergy between Black Templars, especially with their Primaris Sword Brethren and reactive moves. So one thing you can do is use it as a transport for your Sword Brethren to hide in. Once it's disembarked into Assault Intercessors, it has a transport capacity of 7, so a Sword Brethren unit's able to embark into it in its entirety. So one thing we can do potentially is disembark the Sword Brethren unit from their Repulsor Executioner, charge into an enemy unit, and then run the Impulsor up next to them. That means that if the enemy unit falls back from them, you're going to be able to immediately reactive move back into the Impulsor and force your opponent to kill the Impulsor before attacking your valuable Sword Brethren. Again, that's a little bit more of a high-level tactic, but it's something to keep in mind as you progress with the game. Now, last and certainly not least, we are adding another epic hero to the army. We are adding High Marshal Helbrecht. Helbrecht is one of the most powerful melee characters in the faction. He has an incredibly powerful melee profile and a strong leadership ability that gives you additional strength and attacks to his whole unit, which is good because the Primaris Crusaders have a relatively low strength characteristic to start with. However, they do have sustained hits, so a high attack volume is very good for them because they're kind of a dedicated infantry sweeper. Whereas you want to be attacking your Sword Brethren into higher toughness targets to benefit from all those lethal hits, the Crusade Squad is good into small, lightly armored enemies that they can just use their chainswords to cleave through. In addition, High Marshal Helbrecht also benefits himself from having larger units, since based on the size of his unit, he'll inflict mortal wounds to enemies at the start of the fight phase, which allows him to potentially even knock damage into heavier targets before his unit even gets to swing. He's a very powerful character in and of himself, and he's particularly good when he's inside Primaris Crusaders, so he makes the best synergy with this unit. Now, a little bit unlike playing this army in an incursion style, where you're only focused on really babying one of these Primaris Sword Brethren units, because we have potentially 3 each independently incredibly powerful melee units between the Assault Intercessors and the 2 Sword Brethren squads, all in transports, we can afford to play a little bit more aggressively. This army tends to want to sort of threat overload its opponent. Well, you should never put your Repulsor Executioners in a position where they die for no reason. If you can set up a situation where you can get value out of that by shooting at your opponent, and then also threaten very strong melee threats with Assault Doctrine and the disembarkation from your Sword Brethren, you can set up a situation where your opponent doesn't have the firepower to actually deal with everything before you start scoring objectives. So oftentimes what you want to do is use your lighter units like we talked about before. Things like your Blade Guard veterans and your Scout squads can run up to score objectives and to threaten hold of objectives. Force your opponent to move forward to respond to those models, and then simply move forward with all of your models in a true Black Templars manner with wanton aggression against the enemies of the Imperium. Push forward all of your ranged units, deliver a pretty devastating Alpha Strike with your ranged attacks, and then set up for a position where you can then disembark and charge your enemy with those Sword Brethren on the subsequent turn. Especially if you have positions where you can get your Repulsor Executioners up the battlefield without necessarily putting them in harm's way. Staging them in forward areas like this where they can move forward to get lines of sight to your opponent, but then also potentially disembark infantry to go to attack is hugely powerful. So despite the fact that these things look like they are giant ranged gun platforms that want to engage from the far side of the table, in fact, in Black Templars, they are much more of a land raider. And you could even almost replace them with land raiders in this army if you really felt like it. Land raiders are typically a little bit more expensive, so it's a little tougher. And the way they play is very similar. They want to protect their infantry as they move up the table and bully your opponent with their shooting. Even if they die, it's not the end of the world, because as long as your opponent doesn't have the follow-up attacks to kill their Sword Brethren, whatever killed them is likely just to die to the Sword Brethren squad in response. Now, the Ballistus Dreadnoughts I usually like to keep towards the flanks of the table. They aren't particularly good in melee, so you want to make sure that your opponent isn't able to really get powerful melee units to them, but they are good at holding down objectives, and they have an incredibly long range, so opening up these kind of enfilading fire around the sides of the battlefield with your Ballistus Dreadnoughts gives them a lot of opportunities to just blast away with las cannon and missile shots onto enemies on the opposite end. And together with the Repulsor Executioner heavy laser destroyer shots, they provide a ton of anti-tank to the army before you even get into melee. Now, High Marshal Helbrecht, as I mentioned before, is a little bit difficult to carry around because the Crusader squad is difficult to transport. However, just like we talked about previously, we could start him in reserve and then use a rapid ingress to bring him onto the battlefield during your opponent's turn. So in a similar situation to what we just talked about, trying to find a spot for them where your opponent doesn't have a huge line of sight, and then setting them up to then move and charge on the subsequent turn. And if you have a turn where you are pushing your whole army forward, getting these guys up into a spot where they can either split your opponent's attacks between your central brick of heavy vehicles and the Sword Brethren who are coming off the side is going to be an important thing to keep in mind. If you're up against a very aggressive opponent, however, who wants to be absorbing board control and screening out a lot, you can simply keep these guys on the battlefield to start and then stage them in a ruin somewhere in the center of the battlefield to push forward and clear out enemies or threaten objectives in the future. It's definitely not required that you put them in reserve, but I do always recommend that you put something in reserve, at least to keep your opponent's head down, even if it's just Ballistus Dreadnoughts coming off the table edge, in order to ensure that your opponent's never really safe from your ranged fire. If you keep in mind your reactive active effects and you make sure that you don't wildly overcommit your melee, especially to stuff that you're going to be shooting at already, you can continue this sort of pressure through the middle of the table for a long time during the game. Definitely, once your units are committed and once you're ready to fight, don't be scared about losing a battle tank or two. It's not the end of the world if they die, and as long as they do so while delivering your melee infantry, you're going to get enough value out of them that it's going to be just fine. You certainly don't want to trade them away for nothing, but at least if your opponent has to commit something very big to them that you can then counterattack with your infantry or your other ranged attacks, you won't feel that bad about it. If your vehicles need to move farther in order to get lines of sight to your targets, even if they have to move close to enemies, so don't forget that you have powerful melee units inside them, so even if your opponent has to respond by moving close to you, that's usually beneficial for you. But if you need that burst of speed, consider calling Devastator Doctrine early in order to get those battle tanks into melee. Usually you'll see a turn 1 or 2 Devastator Doctrine be called to make sure that your big guns can get on target. Then call Assault Doctrine once your opponent's engaged to counterattack them with the Sword Brethren, and then as the sort of battle becomes a scrum, you start to call Tactical Doctrine in order to allow your units to fall back and still operate normally. Usually your opponent won't have the firepower to deal with all of these high toughness vehicles and their occupants all at once, and that's going to allow you to deliver them into the fight and get huge value from them, and that you can usually roll that out into a victory. Now, in terms of expanding this army, there are a couple of optimizations you can do. Units like the Blade Guard veterans are not super useful in this faction, as I mentioned before, so them being included in the combat patrol is a little bit funny, but you can do things like remove them and pare down your Sword Brethren squads to smaller units in order to open more points for either more Sword Brethren squads or potentially even more repulsors. You could also, with a couple extra points, switch repulsors for Land Raiders if you want closer ranged, higher toughness shooting. Taking additional utility options like jump pack intercessors or scout squads is also never bad, and you can even try some of the other epic heroes in the faction like Chaplain Grimaldus, who doesn't have quite as much damage output as High Marshal Halbrecht, but he does make your unit quite a bit faster, which can make it easier for Crusader squads to get to melee if they're already on the table. From there's a couple interesting builds both in the Space Marine Codex and in the Black Templars faction proper. In the Space Marine Codex, you can focus on those really powerful pintle-mounted guns on Black Templars vehicles by taking something like Iron Storm Spearhead, which still allows you to bring a lot of transports and have that synergy with Primaris Sword Brethren, but also makes your vehicle slightly more effective, allowing you to take things like mass impulsors or more repulsor executioners to do even more damage. On a similar note, you can also move to Godhammer Assault Force inside the Black Templars Codex. This is a vehicle-focused detachment that gives you a lot of huge benefits for disembarking transport, so if we are using executioners and impulsors to deliver our melee squads, that's a good direction to go in. In addition, that also has the greatest synergy with Land Raiders, so if you like Land Raider units in particular, that's the detachment that you probably want to build towards. But with that, that's a basic overview of the Black Templars faction in Warhammer 40k and how to get started. Let me know down in the comment section if you like the lists that I have constructed and what your Black Templars look like, and what faction you'd like me to cover next. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, whether that's over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, or Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.